She was 9 months pregnant alone, pulling everything she owned through a blizzard. Hundreds had passed her without stopping. Then one rough-looking rancher reined in his wagon, looked at her once, and growled, "Get in my wagon." She thought he was the last man she should trust, but what happened after that ride changed both of their lives forever. Stay until the end, because this unforgettable Wild West story proves that sometimes the kindest hearts speak with the hardest voices. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more emotional Wild West stories filled with courage, compassion, and unforgettable endings. The first winter storm arrived without warning, swallowing the mountain trails beneath thick blankets of snow. Bitter winds howled across the lonely frontier, covering wagon tracks almost as quickly as they appeared. Travelers hurried toward town before darkness fell, leaving the wilderness empty except for one exhausted woman. 26-year-old Sarah leaned her full weight against the handle of an old wooden handcart. Every painful step sank deep into the snow. Inside the cart were all the belongings she had left in the world: a worn blanket, a cast iron pot, a family Bible, a few pieces of clothing, and a tiny pair of baby shoes she had sewn herself while dreaming of a better future. She rested one trembling hand on her swollen stomach. Just a little farther, she whispered to the child growing inside her. Only a month earlier, sickness had taken her husband, leaving her with nothing except debt and grief. The landlord had forced her from their cabin, and now she wandered toward the next settlement, praying someone might offer work before her baby arrived. But no one stopped. Several wagons rolled past. A few riders glanced at her before looking away. Some feared trouble. Others simply didn't care. As snow continued falling, Sarah stumbled onto one knee. Her breathing became shallow, and tears froze upon her cheeks. She struggled to lift the heavy cart again, but her strength was fading. Far down the trail, another wagon slowly approached. Its driver was a broad-shouldered rancher wrapped in a weathered sheepskin coat. His dark hat was dusted with snow, and a thick beard hid most of his face. The people in nearby towns called him Caleb Turner. Some said he was rude. Others claimed he hated company. Ever since his wife died years earlier, Caleb had lived alone on his mountain ranch, speaking more often to his horses than to people. He noticed the woman from a distance. He noticed her swollen belly. He noticed the trembling in her hands. Without saying a word, he pulled the wagon to a stop. Sarah lowered her eyes, expecting him to continue like everyone else. Instead, the rancher climbed down. He stared at the heavy cart, then at the frightened widow. His voice came out rough, almost like a command. "Get in my wagon." Sarah blinked. I couldn't ask that of you. You didn't." He reached for the cart. "I said get in." She hesitated. Stories about lonely men living deep in the mountains were rarely comforting. Caleb noticed her fear. He simply pointed toward the warm blanket inside the wagon. "If I meant you harm," he said quietly, "I wouldn't have stopped." For several long seconds, only the wind answered. Then Sarah climbed aboard. Caleb carefully lifted her handcart into the wagon before covering her with a thick buffalo blanket. Neither of them spoke as the horses began pulling the wagon through the falling snow. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt safe. As darkness settled across the valley, Caleb glanced toward her only once. "You eaten today?" Sarah lowered her eyes. She couldn't lie. "No." Without another word, Caleb handed her the last piece of warm bread from his own coat pocket. He pretended not to notice the tears running down her face as she quietly whispered, "Thank you." Neither of them realized it yet, but before this winter ended, that simple ride would become the beginning of a family neither of them had ever dared to dream about. The journey through the snow lasted nearly 2 hours. Neither Caleb nor Sarah spoke much. The only sounds were the horses' steady footsteps, the wagon wheels crunching over frozen ground, and the winter wind whispering through the pine trees. Every so often Caleb glanced toward Sarah to make sure she was warm enough. When he noticed her shivering, he silently draped another wool blanket across her shoulders. She wasn't used to such quiet kindness. Most people who had offered help expected something in return. Caleb asked for nothing. As night settled over the mountains, a warm light appeared in the distance. "My ranch," Caleb said simply. The wagon stopped beside a sturdy log cabin surrounded by stacked firewood, a small barn, and fenced horses. Smoke drifted from the chimney, promising warmth against the bitter cold. Caleb climbed down first. Easy now. He offered his hand. Sarah hesitated only a moment before accepting it. Inside, the cabin was simple but welcoming. A large stone fireplace filled the room with warmth. Shelves lined the walls, and everything was clean, though it was obvious no woman had lived there for years. "I'll start supper," Caleb said. Sarah looked surprised. "You cook?" He gave a small grin. "I don't starve." She couldn't help smiling for the first time in weeks. While Caleb stirred venison stew over the fire, Sarah quietly noticed unwashed dishes stacked beside the sink, torn curtains hanging over the windows, and clothes needing mending. The cabin wasn't dirty. It was simply the home of a man who had lived alone for far too long. After supper, Caleb spread fresh blankets across the bed in the only bedroom. "You'll sleep here." Sarah immediately shook her head. "I can't take your room." "You can?" "And you?" "I've slept beside that fireplace plenty of times." As she tried to argue again, Caleb simply smiled. "I'm too stubborn to lose." For the first time since losing her husband, Sarah laughed. The sound filled the lonely cabin. It had been years since Caleb had heard laughter inside those walls. The following morning, Sarah woke early and quietly began sweeping the floor, washing dishes, and baking fresh bread from the flour Caleb had stored away. When Caleb returned from feeding the horses, he stopped in the doorway. The cabin smelled like warm bread instead of smoke. The windows had been cleaned. The table was neatly set. It didn't feel empty anymore. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. Sarah lowered her eyes. "I wanted to earn your kindness." Caleb gently shook his head. "You already did?" Days slowly turned into weeks. Sarah cooked hearty meals while Caleb worked the ranch. She mended torn shirts, tended the small garden greenhouse, and filled the cabin with warmth that no fire alone could provide. Meanwhile, the growing baby was due any day. But not everyone approved. When Caleb rode into town for supplies, whispers followed him. "That widow's living with him. People will talk. He'll regret it." Caleb loaded another sack of flour into the wagon and calmly answered without looking back, "Folks are free to talk. I'm free to do what's right." The gossip continued, but Caleb never once asked Sarah to leave, because deep inside, he had already begun thinking of the lonely widow and her unborn child. As family, and before winter released its icy grip, a single storm would test that feeling more than either of them could have imagined. A week later, the fiercest blizzard of the winter swept across the mountains. Snow buried the fences, the wind shook the cabin, and before sunrise Sarah cried out in pain. The baby, Caleb's heart raced. Without a second thought, he saddled his fastest horse and rode through the blinding storm to bring the nearest midwife. The journey was dangerous, but he never slowed down. Hours later, he returned with the elderly woman just in time. That evening, the tiny cabin echoed with the joyful cry of a healthy baby girl. Caleb stood quietly outside the bedroom, relief washing over him as tears filled his eyes. The midwife smiled. "Go meet your family." He stepped inside. Sarah looked up, exhausted but smiling, holding the tiny baby wrapped in a warm blanket. "If you hadn't stopped your wagon that day," she whispered, "she wouldn't be here." Caleb gently touched the baby's tiny hand. "No," he replied softly. "If I hadn't stopped, I'd still be the loneliest man in these mountains." Weeks passed, and the gossip around town slowly disappeared. People no longer spoke about the widow living at Caleb's ranch. They spoke about the kind rancher who had risked everything to save a mother and her child. When spring finally melted the snow, Caleb walked Sarah to the same road where he had first found her struggling alone. He smiled and took her hand. "I told you to get in my wagon." She laughed through happy tears. "You did. I forgot to tell you something else." She looked into his eyes. "You never have to leave." A few months later, beneath the wide western sky, Caleb and Sarah were married in the little mountain church. Friends, neighbors, and the grateful midwife gathered to celebrate. The tiny baby slept peacefully in Sarah's arms as the lonely rancher finally found the family he had thought was lost forever. People remembered the story for years afterward. A rough voice said, "Get in my wagon." But behind those words was the warmest heart on the frontier. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes that one act of kindness can change an entire life. See you in the next Wild West story!